When Margaret of Anjou died at Château Dampierre near Saumur in the August of 1482, it was as a woman not only retired from the world, but almost forgotten by it. She, who had been for a time the virtual ruler of Lancashire in England, who had raised armies and intrigued with princes, had not enough money to pay her debts except through the uncertain charity of her uncharitable cousin, the King of France. Everyone here knows at least something about the 100 Years' War, like how it was actually 116 years long, or maybe even about its creation of the national monarchy, but I've already talked about those in another video. What many of you don't know is how the court intrigues and factions invested in War and Peace began not only England's longest civil war, but also contributed to the creation of Portugal, a proposed partition of England, and the beginnings of the early modern era. These are the Wars of the Roses, and why they happened. The initial decade of uncertainty, from 1450 to 60, is the focus of this video. It saw the clashing of two formidable, motivated and ambitious figures. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England and Princess of France, was at the head of those nobles who, tired of the century-long conflict which had so defined Western Europe during this high medieval period. Opposed to her, although not necessarily seeking the overthrow of the monarchy, was the powerful Dukes of York, Edward and Richard. Also the Earl of March, his dynasty, were powerful landowners and claimants to the English throne. During the spring of 1452, Richard, the Duke of York, father of Edward, appealed to the citizens of Shrewsbury for aid in his intended march on London. "It is not my will or intention to displace my sovereign lord." Instead, his energies were directed against the king's principal minister, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. York presented to the king a list of articles accusing his rival of incompetence and misgovernance of both France and England, with specific accusations of embezzlement, neglect and treason. It's clear that Richard wished his opponent trialed. Although primary sources disagree as to who is at fault, it's clear that personal enmity and dynastic rivalry were the primary cause of the skirmishes and feuds that took place between the nobles and their private armies. It should be noted, however, that at this point, installing a Yorkist claimant on the throne was not the goal of the rebels. The historian Michael Hicks states, "There was nothing fundamentally wrong with the system, but there were problems that were preconditions which applied to all three wars." For him, the collapse of public order and the issue of dynasticism were two of the key factors which caused the explosion of conflict in 1459. The crisis of 1450 was a precondition for the War of Roses that fell short of civil war, because there were not two sides to fight. King Henry, assisted by Somerset, encamped his forces at Blackheath in order to prevent the attempted coup. Henry, however, did not heed the advice of Somerset, instead listening to the nobles within his court, who supported negotiation with the Duke. G.F. Raymond, writing in the 1790s, states that during the discourse between the Duke and the King's representatives, Richard claimed to be acting only in an attempt to ensure the prosperity of the kingdom, and in doing so, bring justice to the Duke of Somerset and others on the council. Henry, who complied, deprived York of all reasons to keep men under arms, and he was thusly imprisoned by Somerset. In October of the next year, Henry and Margaret of Anjou's first and only living child, Edward, was born. Immediately created Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester, the infant prince would grant Margaret a much greater influence over court. This would have been the case had Henry not suffered the first of a number of bouts of complete mental collapse, during which he was unable to even recognise his newborn son, Edward of Westminster. Although this conflict was averted for most of the year, the death of the regent, Cardinal John Kemp, and a power play by Margaret of Anjou to secure the regency for herself, the Lords convened a regency council, placing at their head the Duke of York, and his regency saw the imprisonment of Somerset, as well as the support of the Nevilles against their Percy rivals. In 1455, the king was somewhat recovered, able again to direct the affairs of the government. He released Somerset from his imprisonment, and in doing so, dismissed York, Warwick and Salisbury, all powerful Yorkists. Both Warwick and Salisbury, sponsored by the Duke of York, would draft and eventually send a letter lobbying the king to bring his unlawful ministers to lawful trial. However, the court faction would threaten the authors with a treason trial, and thusly discredited the letter and its claims in the eyes of the king. In May of 1455, a battle, the first open conflict of the Civil War, would take place in the surroundings of St Albans. These three powerful nobles, afraid of being dispossessed and declared criminals, and perhaps even executed, as the Mortimer family were only a few decades prior, could not lay down their arms as they had done only a few years prior. Somerset and a number of other powerful Lancastrians were killed in the battle. Moreover, the king himself was captured. J.R. Lander, in his book Crown and Nobility, suggests York's motivations at this point were not to take the throne, as well as the circumstances in which he was operating varied greatly between the two periods in which he became Lord Protector. Most modern writers suppose that Henry VI twice became insane during the 1450s, and that the Duke of York twice became the protector and defender of the realm as a result of the king's incapacity to attend to the affairs of state. A close examination of the events leading up to the two protectorates, however, reveal a very different state of affairs on each occasion, and provide material for some inferences about York's intentions and ambitions. And this assessment is almost certainly credible, as the Yorkists immediately submitted to the defeated king, and renewed their oaths of fealty. This piece of political theatre, however, was for the other nobles, as the king was once again suffering another bout of mental collapse, and Richard was reaffirmed Lord Protector. The Queen, whose factions had just been decapitated and herself removed from power, can in this period only be described as enterprising and spirited. A parliament, summoned on the 12th of February, 1456, was presented a stable and recovering Henry, and with the Yorkist lords being otherwise engaged, the powers vested in Richard were once again removed. Instead, this initial period of conflict ending in 1456 with the recovery of the king should be seen as the war party, headed by York and his cousin, the Earl of Warwick, attempting to strip from power the faction of the Queen and Somerset, who instead pursued peace with France. This is perhaps the greatest example of the collapse of public order that Hicks highlights. However, other notable examples such as the Percy Neville feud in the north, or the disputes between the Bonville and Courtenays, one which actually resulted in the Bonvilles being decisively defeated, and their seat of power in Chute being sacked. To explain how these factional struggles between nobles turned into decades of dynastic violence, we need to look at the manoeuvres of Margaret of Anjou in 1457, as well as the other examples of dynastic conflict in the past. Many of the men who fought for Owain Glendower, Edmund Mortimer, and Henry Percy, powerful landowners who all rebelled against Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, the first Lancastrian king, were now in possession of their father's lands, and still remembered the House of Lancaster as usurpers. Deborah Fisher, in her work Royal Wales, states the following: "The Welsh had not altogether forgotten how the House of Lancaster had usurped the throne of the House of York, and there were still men living who had fought under him." These videos take a long time to make, as I research, write, and draw everything myself. If you've watched this long, perhaps you'd give this video a like and send it to someone else you think would like it. This is also the product of historical research that went into creating the first instalment of my EU4 mod, Modus et Ordo, the words of Edward IV. If you're interested in historical research, modding, or just in EU4 in general, join the Discord server in the description to join in.